broke up with me? No, I skipped the whole point. So when I bought that house, right, I put it under my name and his name. And then I made him get off the lease. But he wasn't trying to get off the lease. I'm like, you ain't getting no house key and you ain't living with me. So get your ass off my lease. You feel me? So what's up?
But first, here tonight at 10, the shooting death of a Dayton teen is shining a light on the issue of domestic violence.
17-year-old LaShonda Childs called 911 before she was shot. She told police she had a restraining order against the suspect. 2 News reporter Judith Ratana is speaking with domestic violence experts in our top story at 10.
Right now, the suspect in this case is in custody. We're choosing not to name him until he sees a judge. However, according to the victim's Facebook page, he had exhibited some abusive behavior towards her, behavior that specialists here at YWCA say friends and families need to be vigilant about. LaShonda Childs would have been 18 on Friday. Instead, she was shot and killed. Her death a shock to the community, including those here at YWCA, a domestic violence support center.
It's absolutely heartbreaking.
On October 2nd, 2018, LaShonda Childs, a 17-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, placed a 911 call reporting that her former partner, Trendell Goodwin, was armed and threatening her at a specific address. Police were dispatched to multiple locations as the situation escalated. Later that afternoon, LaShonda and another individual attempted to leave the location in a vehicle when Goodwin allegedly discharged a firearm into the car, striking LaShonda in the head. Emergency responders were notified, and she was transported by private conveyance to Grandview Medical Center. LaShonda succumbed to her injuries the following morning, 2 days before her 18th birthday. Law enforcement later located and arrested Trendell Goodwin at a separate residence in connection with the incident. Court filings indicate he was charged with murder, felonious assault, and weapons violations.
Mr. Goodwin would waive reading of the complaint, enter a not guilty plea, and request preliminary hearing.
Okay. I have case 18 CRA 6365, State of Ohio versus Mr. Goodwin. The case is currently scheduled for a preliminary hearing on October the 12th of this year at 3:30 in the afternoon in courtroom 4B. Did you wish to be heard with regard to a matter of bond at this time?
Your Honor, just that Mr. Goodwin is a lifelong resident of this community. In light of the allegations, we would ask the court just to set the minimum bond necessary to secure his appearance pending the next court date.
The day's events, fully documented in police reports, court filings, and 911 recordings, reveal a premeditated escalation that had been repeatedly signaled prior to the fatal encounter. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin.
Bitches don't even be my friends on Facebook, nothing, still popping up on my life. Bitch, block me. Bitch, I said I had somebody for your big ass. Bitch, I wanted to fight the other 3, bitch.
LaShonda Cheris Childs was born on October 5th, 2000. She was raised in Dayton, Ohio, where she spent most of her life living with family members. At the time of the events documented in police reports, court filings, and social media records, she was a minor. Most of the incidents associated with her case occurred before she turned 18. Individuals familiar with her describe her as motivated, self-directed, and focused on building independence at a young age. These characteristics were reflected in both her daily activities and her long-term goals. LaShonda was enrolled in high school during the period leading up to the documented abuse. While attending school, she showed a consistent interest in cosmetology and beauty-related services. She actively practiced hairstyling, eyebrow grooming, and basic nail services. Unlike many teenagers with casual interests, LaShonda approached these activities with a business-oriented mindset. She promoted her work online, scheduled clients, and accepted payment for services. She operated under the name Beauty Bender LLC, a title she used across social media platforms to present herself as a legitimate service provider despite her age. Her use of social media was multifaceted. Initially, platforms such as Facebook served as tools for promotion, communication with clients, and personal expression. She posted examples of her work, pricing details, and availability. Over time, her online presence expanded beyond business promotion. Social media later became a record of her personal circumstances, including her relationship and the issues surrounding it. These posts were time-stamped and public, creating a documented timeline that would later be examined by investigators, journalists, and the court. As her circumstances changed, LaShonda used the same platforms to describe incidents of abuse and to warn others. These posts included direct references to harm, fear for her safety, and identification of the individual she believed posed a threat to her life.
Like, daddy's little monster. So I got that little quote on my leg. Why this nigga make it look like it said molester? Man, my mama was rolling. When I say I went in the house and I put some shorts on and I'm walking around and it say daddy's little monster, but my mama reading it, I guess she done seen it. She done seen he spelled wrong. She said, do that say Chester the molester? I said, I'm about to kill this nigga.
At the time they were posted, they functioned as warnings. After her death, they became evidence of awareness, escalation, and premeditated concern. The relationship that would later become central to the case began in 2017. LaShonda was still a teenager at the time. The male partner involved was Trendell Goodwin. There was a significant age difference between the two. While LaShonda was under 18, Goodwin was in his late 20s. Early in their interaction, Goodwin reportedly misrepresented his age, initially presenting himself as younger than he actually was. This misrepresentation delayed full awareness of the age gap at the start of the relationship. The relationship progressed quickly, according to records and later testimony. The two began spending increasing amounts of time together shortly after initial contact. Communication became frequent, and LaShonda's time was increasingly centered around the relationship. Early indicators of control and possessiveness were later identified through patterns of behavior rather than a single defining incident. These behaviors included monitoring her whereabouts, questioning her interactions with others, and exerting influence over her daily routine. Isolation behaviors reportedly began early in the relationship. LaShonda spent less time with peers and was increasingly separated from her usual support systems. This pattern was not immediately identified as abuse by those around her, but it later aligned with commonly documented dynamics in abusive relationships. These early dynamics laid the groundwork for further escalation. The abuse escalated from control and monitoring into physical violence. The first documented incidents involved physical assaults that were reported to law enforcement. These reports included allegations that Goodwin struck LaShonda in the face, bit her shoulder, and pulled her hair. Some of these assaults resulted in visible injuries, which were noted in police documentation. These were not isolated allegations. They formed part of a repeated pattern recorded across multiple incidents. Law enforcement involvement increased as the incidents continued. Reports indicated that the violence was not limited to spontaneous arguments, but occurred within a broader framework of control. In addition to physical assaults, Goodwin was accused of confiscating LaShonda's phone, restricting her movements, and confining her inside residences. These actions limited her ability to contact others or seek help independently. Monitoring of her communications was also reported, further reinforcing control over her personal interactions. Threats were documented as part of this pattern. These threats extended beyond LaShonda herself and, in some instances, included others in her life. The presence of threats elevated the risk level associated with the relationship and contributed to law enforcement assessments in later stages of the case. Despite arrests, court orders, and protective measures, contact between LaShonda and Goodwin continued. This continuation occurred even after legal boundaries were established. The relationship followed a cycle commonly observed in domestic violence cases. Periods of violence were followed by reconciliation attempts, promises of change, and temporary reductions in conflict. These cycles contributed to ongoing engagement despite documented risk. Manipulation played a role in maintaining contact. Goodwin's behavior reportedly alternated between aggression and reassurance, creating instability that complicated LaShonda's ability to disengage fully. During this period, LaShonda continued to engage with him despite existing court orders meant to prevent contact. This behavior was later analyzed within the context of trauma bonding, a phenomenon in which victims maintain emotional or practical ties to an abuser due to fear, dependency, or intermittent reinforcement. Court records also reflect this complexity. At one point, LaShonda wrote a letter to a judge requesting leniency for Goodwin, stating that the situation had improved. This letter stood in contrast to later public warnings she posted online. Together, these actions illustrated the fluctuating nature of her situation rather than a clear resolution. What distinguishes this case from many others is the level of documentation created before the fatal outcome. Police reports, court filings, and social media posts collectively formed a detailed record of escalation. LaShonda demonstrated awareness of the danger she faced. Her online posts explicitly identified the risk, named the individual involved, and warned others of potential consequences. These records show that the violence was not hidden or sudden. It unfolded over time, with multiple opportunities for intervention. The combination of formal legal documentation and informal public warnings created a comprehensive timeline that later became central to understanding the case. This section of the story establishes a foundation for everything that followed. The background, relationship dynamics, and documented escalation reveal a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Each step built upon the last, setting the stage for the events that ultimately occurred. From the earliest documented incidents, law enforcement and the court system were repeatedly involved in the relationship between LaShonda Childs and Trendell Goodwin. These interactions created an extensive paper trail that later became central to understanding how the case unfolded. Trendell Goodwin was arrested multiple times in connection with allegations of assault involving LaShonda Childs. Police reports indicate that these incidents occurred over several months and involved repeated physical confrontations. The allegations included striking, biting, and other forms of physical violence consistent with domestic assault classifications. Several of these arrests resulted in formal charges related to domestic violence. However, the outcomes of these charges varied. Some charges were reduced during court proceedings, while others were dismissed altogether. In certain instances, prosecutors declined to pursue the most severe charges available under the law. As a result, the legal consequences imposed during these early encounters were limited in scope. Goodwin did serve brief periods of jail time related to some of the arrests. These periods were short and did not result in long-term incarceration. Court records show that he was released back into the community, while the relationship with LaShonda continued intermittently. Each release occurred despite an existing history of allegations tied to the same victim. This pattern of arrest followed by release created a cycle in which documented violence did not lead to sustained separation or permanent legal restriction. The case history shows multiple opportunities where escalating intervention could have occurred, but instead the legal response remained incremental. As incidents continued, LaShonda sought additional legal protection through the civil court system. She obtained a civil protection order against Goodwin. The order legally required him to have no contact with her and to maintain a specified physical distance at all times. The conditions of the protection order were explicit. Goodwin was prohibited from contacting LaShonda directly or indirectly. This included phone calls, text messages, social media communication, and physical presence within the designated distance outlined in the order. Violation of these conditions could result in arrest and additional criminal charges. Despite the clarity of the order, enforcement proved inconsistent. Court and police records later reflected allegations that Goodwin violated the terms of the protection order. These alleged violations included continued contact and presence near LaShonda. However, not every alleged violation resulted in immediate arrest or prosecution. The protection order remained legally active, but its effectiveness depended on enforcement. In practice, enforcement relied on reporting, officer discretion, and follow-up actions that did not always occur in a timely manner. This gap between the existence of the order and its enforcement became a significant factor in the case timeline. In addition to arrest and protective orders, Goodwin was placed on probation following one of his assault cases. The probation terms included standard conditions and specific requirements related to domestic violence offenses. Among these was an order to participate in counseling or intervention programs. Probation records indicate that these conditions were imposed as part of an effort to address behavior without imposing long-term incarceration. The court's approach focused on supervision and compliance rather than removal from the community. At later points, motions were filed to terminate or modify Goodwin's probation. These motions suggested that he had met certain conditions or that continued supervision was no longer deemed necessary. Court filings show that probation decisions were made while prior allegations and protective orders remained part of the record. A review of court documents reveals gaps between reported violations and judicial consequences. In some cases, allegations of noncompliance did not immediately result in hearings or sanctions. This created periods where the legal status of restrictions was unclear or loosely enforced. The combined effect of probation, counseling requirements, and reduced charges resulted in a situation where legal oversight existed but was fragmented. Multiple systems, criminal court, civil court, and probation supervision, were operating simultaneously without consistent escalation. During this period of ongoing legal involvement, LaShonda wrote a letter to the judge overseeing one of Goodwin's cases. In the letter, she requested leniency on his behalf. She stated that they were past the violence and implied that the situation had improved. The letter became part of the official court record. Its presence is significant because it contrasted with police reports and prior allegations already documented. It reflected a moment where the victim advocated for reduced legal consequences for the accused. This action demonstrated several documented dynamics commonly present in domestic violence cases. It indicated possible emotional pressure to maintain peace, fear of retaliation, or belief that the situation could change. It also reflected the complexity of victim decision-making within abusive relationships. At the time the letter was written, it contributed to the court's understanding of the relationship. The request for leniency may have influenced decisions regarding probation, sentencing, or supervision. Importantly, the letter was written before LaShonda later made public warnings about her safety. In hindsight, the letter stands in contrast to subsequent actions taken by LaShonda, particularly her later decision to publicly document abuse and express fear for her life. In the weeks leading up to her death, LaShonda used social media to document her situation in detail. She posted multiple statements describing abuse by Goodwin. These posts were explicit, direct, and unambiguous. In her posts, LaShonda stated that she had been abused and that she believed she was in danger. She warned others not to ignore signs of violence in relationships. In some posts, she expressed concern that the situation could escalate to a fatal outcome. Notably, she named Goodwin directly in these warnings. This removed ambiguity about who she believed posed a threat. The posts were time-stamped and publicly visible, creating a permanent record of her concerns before the fatal incident. These statements were later reviewed by investigators and the public. They demonstrated that LaShonda anticipated further violence and had attempted to document it in advance. The social media posts were widely shared. Friends, acquaintances, and community members responded with concern. Comments encouraged her to seek safety and acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. The warnings were not private messages. They were public declarations. This meant that knowledge of the alleged danger extended beyond immediate family or law enforcement and into the broader community. After her death, these posts were cited as evidence of premeditation and forewarning. They showed that the risk was known, articulated, and documented prior to shooting. They also demonstrated that the violence did not occur without warning or history. In the weeks leading up to October 2nd, 2018, court records show that a civil protection order was in effect between LaShonda Childs and Trendell Goodwin. The order prohibited contact and required physical distance between the two. Despite this, evidence later revealed that communication and interaction had resumed. The reasons for continued contact were not formally resolved in court records, but documentation indicates that the separation imposed by legal measures did not remain intact. Witness accounts and investigative summaries suggest that Goodwin continued to track LaShonda's movements during this period. Monitoring behaviors included repeated appearances at locations she frequented and continued attempts to assert presence in her personal life. This activity occurred despite previous arrests and judicial instructions to disengage. Law enforcement later acknowledged that Enforcement and Protection Order relied heavily on reporting violations as they occurred, rather than proactive monitoring. During this time, tensions escalated. Prior incidents had already established a pattern of confrontation, control, and violence. The reestablishment of contact occurred against that background. There is no indication in the record that additional protective measures were implemented in response to renewed interaction. On October 2nd, 2018, a series of events unfolded that would later be reconstructed through police reports, witness statements, and emergency call records. The day did not begin with law enforcement involvement. Instead, it developed through interpersonal conflict that escalated rapidly. An argument occurred involving LaShonda Childs, Trendell Goodwin, and another male individual. The identity of the third person was included in police documentation, but was not central to the charges filed. The dispute reportedly centered on personal relationships and unresolved tensions between the parties. The conflict did not remain confined to a single location. Investigators later determined that the individuals moved between locations during the argument. This movement complicated the timeline and required officers to assess multiple scenes after the shooting occurred. Statements indicate that the confrontation intensified as it progressed, with raised voices and threats reported by witnesses. At some point during the confrontation, a firearm was present. Investigators later confirmed that Goodwin was in possession of a gun despite previous restrictions related to his criminal history. The presence of the firearm marked a critical escalation in the encounter. According to case records, the situation had shifted from verbal confrontation to a potentially lethal encounter before law enforcement arrived. Before the shooting occurred, LaShonda placed a call to 911. The call was recorded and later preserved as evidence. During the call, she identified Trendell Goodwin by name. She reported that she was in immediate danger and that Goodwin was the source of threat. The call included location details, allowing dispatchers to determine where officers needed to respond. The information provided was clear enough for emergency services to begin dispatching units. The call was treated as a high-risk domestic violence situation due to the identification of a specific individual and the indication of imminent danger. The recording later became a significant piece of evidence, establishing that LaShonda had recognized the threat and attempted to obtain help before the shooting occurred. The call also confirmed that she was aware of the risk posed by Goodwin and had taken steps to involve law enforcement prior to being injured. Officers were en route when events escalated further. According to investigative findings, shots were fired during the confrontation shortly after the 911 call. The exact number of shots was documented during forensic analysis, along with shell casing locations and ballistic evidence recovered from the scene. LaShonda Child was struck by gunfire. Evidence indicates that the shooting occurred as she was attempting to leave the immediate area. Witness statements later supported the conclusion that she was not advancing toward Goodwin at the time she was shot. Instead, the physical positioning suggested an attempt to disengage from the confrontation. Multiple witnesses were later referenced in police reports. Some reported hearing gunshots, while others reported seeing individuals flee the scene immediately afterward. The movement between locations and the presence of multiple individuals complicated early witness accounts, requiring investigators to conduct follow-up interviews. Law enforcement later confirmed that the gun used in the shooting was recovered and linked to Goodwin. Following the shooting, LaShonda was transported to the hospital. Notably, she was not transported by ambulance. Instead, she was taken to Grandview Medical Center by private conveyance. The reason for the absence of ambulance transport was addressed in later investigative summaries, but did not alter the medical outcome. Upon arrival at Grandview Medical Center, medical personnel attempted life-saving measures. Despite these efforts, LaShonda's injuries were severe. She later died from gunshot wounds. Law enforcement secured the scene and initiated a manhunt for Goodwin. Within hours, he was located and taken into custody without further incident. The final hours of LaShonda Child's life were later examined in detail during court proceedings. Prosecutors emphasized that the shooting did not occur in isolation. It followed months of documented abuse, court involvement, and repeated warnings. The 911 call, in particular, demonstrated that the danger was known and communicated before the fatal act occurred. Investigators highlighted that the sequence of events showed escalation rather than spontaneity. Continued contact despite protection order, the presence of firearm movement across locations, and the attempt to flee all contributed to the conclusion that the shooting was a culmination of a sustained pattern of violence. The timeline established by police records, emergency call logs, and witness statements formed the foundation of the criminal case that followed. LaShonda Sherish Childs was pronounced dead on October 3, 2018, at Grandview Medical Center in Dayton, Ohio. Medical records confirmed that her death resulted from gunshot wounds sustained during an incident that occurred the previous day. The injuries were determined to be incompatible with survival, despite emergency medical intervention. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office conducted a full examination and formally ruled her death a homicide. The timing of her death was documented as particularly close to a personal milestone. LaShonda was 17 years old at the time of her death and was scheduled to turn 18 years old on October 5, 2018, 2 days later. Her age placed her legally in the category of a minor during the majority of the events leading up to the shooting, including the documented abuse, court proceedings, and the issuance of protection order. Hospital intake records indicate that LaShonda arrived with critical injuries after being transported by private vehicle rather than emergency medical services. This detail later became part of the investigative record, as it provided context for the timeline between the shooting and her arrival at the hospital. Medical personnel attempted life-saving measures, but the injuries proved fatal. Law enforcement officials classified the death as a homicide early in the investigation due to multiple factors, including witness statements, physical evidence recovered at the scene, and the nature of the wounds. The classification meant that the case immediately shifted from an emergency response to a criminal investigation led by Dayton Police Department homicide detectives. Following confirmation of LaShonda's death, investigators moved quickly to identify and locate the suspect. Prior to her death, LaShonda had placed a 911 call identifying Trendell Goodwin as the individual she feared. This call was logged, recorded, and preserved. The name provided during the call aligned with existing police records tied to previous domestic violence incidents involving the same individual. Within hours of the shooting, law enforcement officers located Goodwin at a residence on Mama Avenue in Dayton. The arrest occurred without reported resistance. Officers took Goodwin into custody and transported him for questioning. During the arrest and subsequent search, investigators recovered a firearm believed to be connected to the shooting. Ballistics testing was later conducted as part of the evidentiary process. The firearm recovery strengthened the prosecution's position that the suspect had access to and controlled the weapon used during the incident. Police documentation shows that Goodwin was already known to law enforcement prior to this case. His criminal history included documented domestic violence incidents, several of which involved LaShonda Childs. These records were immediately reviewed by detectives to establish context, motive, and pattern of behavior. Before the fatal shooting, Trendell Goodwin had been arrested and charged in connection with multiple incidents involving LaShonda. Police reports detailed allegations of physical assault, including striking, biting, and other acts of violence. Court records showed that at least one civil protection order had been issued against him at LaShonda's request. The existence of this history became a critical component of the homicide investigation. Detectives reviewed prior incident reports, probation records, and court filings to determine whether the shooting fit into a broader pattern of escalating behavior. Prosecutors later argued that the homicide was not an isolated act, but rather the culmination of repeated violent conduct. This documented history also affected how the case was charged. Because Goodwin had prior domestic violence involvement and was under legal restrictions at different points, the prosecution considered aggravating factors when determining which charges to pursue. Following his arrest, Trendell Goodwin was formally charged with multiple felony offenses. The charges were announced after prosecutors reviewed the available evidence, including forensic findings, witness statements, and historical records. The primary charge was murder, reflecting the allegation that Goodwin knowingly caused the death of LaShonda Childs. Under Ohio law, this charge carries severe penalties, including the possibility of life imprisonment. In addition to the murder charge, prosecutors filed a charge of felonious assault. This charge was connected to the act of causing serious physical harm through the use of a deadly weapon. While the homicide charge addressed the fatal outcome, the felonious assault charge focused on the violent act itself. Goodwin was also charged with weapons violations, including firearm-related offenses. These charges stem from possession and use of a firearm during the incident, particularly in light of his prior legal restrictions and criminal history. During early court proceedings, prosecutors made it clear that they intended to highlight Goodwin's pattern of abuse as part of their case. Rather than presenting the shooting as a spontaneous event, the prosecution framed it as the final escalation in a series of documented violent acts. Court filings referenced prior assault charges involving the same victim, violations or alleged violations of protection orders, police responses to earlier incidents, social media posts made by LaShonda warning about ongoing danger. Prosecutors argued that these elements demonstrated intent, foreseeability, and disregard for legal boundaries. The history of violence was used to establish motive and to counter any defense claims that the shooting was accidental or isolated. Once charges were filed, Goodwin was held in custody pending court proceedings. Bond considerations reflected the seriousness of the charges and the defendant's prior history. The case was assigned to Montgomery County Common Pleas Court, where it proceeded through standard pretrial phases. The homicide ruling, combined with the domestic violence history, positioned the case as one involving both intimate partner violence and lethal escalation. This classification influenced how evidence was presented and how sentencing considerations were later applied. Following the death of LaShonda Childs, prosecutors moved quickly to assemble a comprehensive case against Trendell Goodwin. The pretrial phase focused on establishing a continuous pattern of behavior rather than treating the shooting as an isolated incident. Investigators and prosecutors relied on multiple categories of evidence, much of which had been created or documented before the fatal encounter. One of the primary components of the prosecution's case was police reports spanning several months prior to the shooting. These reports detailed repeated encounters between law enforcement, LaShonda Childs, and Goodwin. The reports included documented arrests, witness statements, and officer observations from domestic violence calls. Several reports described physical injuries consistent with assault, while others noted violations of court-ordered conditions. These records established a timeline showing repeated law enforcement involvement and escalating conduct. Another critical category of evidence consisted of social media posts made by LaShonda in the weeks and months leading up to her death. Prosecutors introduced posts in which she publicly identified Goodwin by name and described ongoing abuse. These posts were time-stamped and publicly accessible, allowing investigators to verify their authenticity and sequence. The posts were used to demonstrate that LaShonda anticipated harm, attempted to warn others, and identified the same individual who would later be charged with her killing. Prosecutors argued that these posts contradicted any claim that the shooting was accidental or unexpected. The 911 call placed shortly before the shooting was also central to the pretrial case. The recording captured LaShonda contacting emergency services, identifying Goodwin as a threat, and providing location information. The call established real-time awareness of danger and demonstrated that law enforcement had been alerted before the shooting occurred. Prosecutors used the call to show that the situation had escalated to an emergency level prior to the fatal encounter. In addition to contemporaneous evidence, the prosecution introduced prior convictions and court records involving Goodwin. These included earlier assault charges related to LaShonda, probation terms, and violations of protective orders. The records showed that Goodwin had previously been subject to court order restrictions, including no contact provisions. Prosecutors emphasized that these restrictions were in place due to documented violence, not speculation or rumor. During the early stages of the case, the defense entered a not guilty plea on Goodwin's behalf. This plea preserved the defendant's right to a jury trial and allowed defense counsel to review the full scope of the prosecution's evidence. Pre-trial motions addressed evidentiary issues, including the admissibility of social media content and prior acts. The court ruled that much of the historical evidence was relevant because it demonstrated motive, intent, and a pattern of conduct. As the pre-trial process continued, the cumulative weight of the evidence became a central factor in negotiations between the defense and the prosecution. Before the case proceeded to a full jury trial, Trendell Goodwin entered a guilty plea. By pleading guilty, Goodwin acknowledged responsibility for the charges brought against him, including murder and related offenses. The plea eliminated the need for a jury to hear testimony, cross-examination, and closing arguments. The guilty plea served several procedural purposes. It allowed the court to avoid a prolonged trial involving graphic evidence, witness testimony, and extensive review of LaShonda's prior abuse history. It also ensured conviction without the uncertainty of a jury verdict. In exchange, prosecutors did not pursue additional trial phases, though the plea did not eliminate the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. The court conducted a plea hearing to confirm that Goodwin entered the plea knowingly and voluntarily. The judge reviewed the charges, potential penalties, and rights being waived, including the right to trial by jury. The plea was accepted, and the case moved directly to sentencing. At sentencing, the court reviewed the full record of the case, including the pre-sentence investigation report, victim impact documentation submitted by the family, and arguments from both the prosecution and defense. The judge imposed a sentence of 18 years to life in prison. This sentence reflected the severity of the murder charge and included mandatory time before parole eligibility. The life-tail portion of the sentence ensured that release would be subject to parole board review rather than automatic release at the conclusion of a fixed term. In addition to incarceration, the court imposed weapon specifications, acknowledging that a firearm was used in the commission of the crime. These specifications increased the minimum time Goodwin would be required to serve before parole consideration. The court also ordered restitution, which included costs associated with funeral expenses and contributions to the Victim Compensation Fund. These financial penalties were imposed in accordance with state law and reflected statutory requirements rather than discretionary punishment. During sentencing, the judge explicitly referenced the documented pattern of abuse. The court noted that the killing did not occur in isolation and that the defendant had multiple opportunities to alter his behavior following prior arrests, probation terms, and protective orders. The judge stated that the history of violence, combined with violations of court-ordered restrictions, played a role in determining the length and structure of the sentence. Following sentencing, LaShonda Child's family made public statements regarding the outcome of the case. Family members stated that, while the conviction brought legal closure, it did not address the failures that occurred before LaShonda's death. They emphasized that repeated warnings, police reports, and court filings had not resulted in effective protection. The family highlighted what they described as ignored warning signs, including prior arrests, protective orders, and public disclosures made by LaShonda herself. Their statements focus on systemic gaps rather than individual intent, pointing to enforcement issues and delayed responses as contributing factors. In the community, vigils were held to acknowledge LaShonda's death and to bring attention to the broader issue of domestic violence, particularly among teenagers. These gatherings were organized by community members, advocacy groups, and local residents. While not part of the legal case, they contributed to public awareness and discussion. The case was later referenced in domestic violence awareness efforts, including discussions about dating violence, age-disparate relationships, and the limitations of protective orders. Advocates cited the case as an example of how documented abuse can escalate despite formal legal interventions. Over time, LaShonda Child's case became part of a broader conversation about prevention, enforcement, and early intervention. Court records, social media evidence, and law enforcement documentation remain publicly accessible, forming a permanent record of the events leading up to the crime. The death of LaShonda Childs did not occur in isolation or without warning. A review of court records, police reports, and publicly available documentation reveals multiple institutional breakdowns that unfolded over an extended period. These failures were not limited to a single agency or decision, but occurred across enforcement, supervision, and protection mechanisms intended to prevent escalation in domestic violence cases. One of the central safeguards in this case was a civil protection order issued against Trendell Goodwin. The order explicitly prohibited contact and required physical distance between the parties. On paper, the order provided clear restrictions and legal authority for enforcement. In practice, enforcement depended on reporting, response time, and follow-through. Records show continued contact between the victim and the offender after the order was issued. Whether this contact occurred voluntarily, under pressure, or through coercion, the outcome remained the same. The order did not function as a physical barrier. Protection orders rely heavily on reactive enforcement. Law enforcement intervention typically occurs only after a violation is reported. This places a burden on victims, including minors, to recognize violations, initiate reports, and wait for response. In this case, despite prior documented violence, violations did not consistently result in immediate or escalating consequences. The protection order existed, but its deterrent value was limited. There is no evidence of enhanced monitoring, GPS restrictions, or proactive compliance checks. As a result, the order functioned more as a legal formality than an active safety mechanism. At the time of the fatal incident, Goodwin had a documented history of domestic violence and was subject to probation conditions from prior cases. These conditions included counseling and behavior restrictions designed to reduce the risk of repeat offenses. Probation supervision depends on compliance verification, regular check-ins, and swift responses to violations. Court records indicate that Goodwin remained in the community despite multiple allegations of continued aggressive behavior. Motions to terminate or modify probation were filed while the victim was still reporting fear and ongoing contact. There is no indication that probation authorities conducted intensive monitoring tailored to domestic violence risk factors. Domestic violence cases require specialized supervision due to the high likelihood of repeat offenses and escalation. Without focused oversight, probation conditions can become procedural rather than preventative. The gap between probation requirements and real-world behavior widened over time. Violations, if documented, did not consistently result in detention or increased supervision. This allowed patterns of control and intimidation to continue without interruption. A recurring issue in this case was a delay between reported incidents and meaningful consequences. Police responses, court hearings, and probation actions occurred within a system constrained by scheduling, caseloads, and procedural thresholds. Domestic violence cases often involve multiple low-level charges rather than a single catastrophic event. Each incident may appear manageable in isolation, but collectively they indicate escalation. In this case, prior assaults, threats, and violations accumulated without triggering decisive intervention. Delays weaken deterrence. When violations do not result in immediate consequences, offenders may perceive reduced risk. The absence of swift penalties allows patterns of behavior to continue and intensify. For victims, delays increase exposure. Each unresolved incident extends a period during which contact can resume. In this case, the timeline between reported abuse, legal action, and enforcement created repeated windows where protection was theoretical rather than practical. LaShonda Childs was a minor during much of the documented abuse. Teenage victims face distinct vulnerabilities, including limited autonomy, dependence on adults for transportation and housing, and difficulty navigating legal systems. Despite these factors, the protective measures applied in this case mirrored those used for adult victims. There is little evidence of specialized intervention tailored to her age. This includes the absence of youth-focused advocacy services, school-based intervention coordination, or enhanced supervision for adult offenders involved with minors. Teenage victims may also be more susceptible to pressure to recant, minimize abuse, or advocate for leniency, as seen in the letter written to the court. Without specialized safeguards, such actions can undermine the protective intent of the legal process. The system treated the case procedurally rather than developmentally, failing to account for the power imbalance inherent in an age-gap relationship involving a minor. The circumstances surrounding this case extend beyond individual actions and highlight broader structural issues in how dating violence, particularly among minors, is addressed. Dating violence among teenagers is often underestimated due to assumptions about the seriousness of adolescent relationships. However, this case demonstrates that violence within teenage relationships can mirror adult domestic abuse patterns, including escalation, control, and lethal outcomes. Legal systems are often slower to intervene decisively when victims are young, particularly when relationships are informal or lack cohabitation. This can delay recognition of risk until violence becomes severe. The significant age difference between the victim and the offender introduced a clear power imbalance. Differences in life experience, legal knowledge, and autonomy created conditions where control could be exerted more easily. Age misrepresentation at the start of the relationship further complicates consent and accountability. Systems often fail to scrutinize age gap dynamics unless statutory violations are explicitly alleged. In this case, the imbalance persisted across legal interactions, with the adult offender navigating the system more effectively than the teenage victim. LaShonda Childs used social media to document abuse and warn others. These posts provided timestamps, names, and descriptions that later aligned with official records. While social media does not replace formal reporting, it served as a public archive of escalating danger. However, these warnings did not trigger institutional intervention beyond existing processes. This highlights a gap between public disclosure and formal response. Systems currently lack mechanisms to integrate such warnings into real-time risk assessments. This case illustrates a fundamental limitation. Legal protections are only as effective as their enforcement. Protection orders, probation conditions, and reporting mechanisms did exist. What failed was consistent, proactive application. Without enforcement, legal tools become symbolic rather than functional. The presence of paperwork did not translate into safety. The events leading to the death of LaShonda Childs were not sudden, random, or unforeseeable. The violence was documented repeatedly across multiple platforms and institutions. Each incident added to an observable pattern. Warnings existed in police reports, court filings, probation records, and public posts. Interventions occurred but lacked coordination, urgency, and enforcement strength. The unresolved question remains central to this case and others like it. How many warnings must exist before intervention is effective? If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.